On the second day of the new year, the boiler in Lee Huayun's apartment stopped working. He thought he might have rented a house with a boiler that was about to break soon. Then a man walked outside the apartment, mad and shouting. "That young people today need to learn how to save on heating," he shouted. He told them to wear thick underwear and to put bubble wrap on the windows. He also reminded them that he said not to use the boiler too much. Lee knew it was the way of that mean old man to tell him ahead of time that the boiler would go out, but he also knew that if he told the old man the boiler was broken, the old man would surely blame him for everything. He knew that the old man would say he had to pay for fixes, and would then say he had to raise the rent because he didn't take care of the house. There would be other silly talk like that. He wanted to hide the nasty old man in the yard, but he didn't want to cause trouble for him. The old man had lived a hard and dull life since birth. A freezing cold shower fit better than a hot shower from a working boiler, and maybe he was fooled by the words of that mean old man. The next thing he knew, he left his tiny apartment to buy bubble wrap for the windows. He thinks it was called the butterfly effect, because the flutter of a butterfly's wings can cause a storm on the other side of the world. But he didn't know back then that a small event like his boiler breaking down would change his life completely. On January 2nd, 2020, at 9 p.m, he was in the store asking a woman where to find bubble wrap. She told him it was to the right of the big post with the letter F on it. He walked that way, thinking that the store had everything. As he walked, a child asked his father if he could get a tool, but the child's father asked why he would need a monkey wrench and told the child to put it down. The father and child kept walking, with the child amazed at the monkey wrench. Our main character's name is Lee Huayun, and according to the orphanage director, his father, who he never met, gave him that name. Hua in his name means peaceful, and Yun means to achieve. But with a name meaning peaceful achievement, he has lived a life that is the total opposite. Huayun was left by his parents at birth, and the orphanage did no more than give him a place to sleep and eat. But it was the place that made him want to be stronger, and he thought that money would make him powerful, so he worked hard, even in high school. But his poor schooling and lack of money meant he could only get part-time jobs. One thing he learned is that even if he gave up his little time, he'd only earned small change, making him think the world is tough. He stopped at the machetes row, picked one up and smiled, thinking it was nice and looked fun. A lady asked a man what was wrong with Huayun and why he was smiling at those machetes, but the man said he didn't know, and that Huayun was giving him some creepy vibes. Huayun looked at the sharp machete and thought it brought back memories, when he saw that his hard work wasn't even worth one 10,001 note. It was a tough time for him back then, and he knew orphans like him couldn't join the army, so he became a fighter, fighting in many battles and wars around the world as part of Force One. It was a worldwide group of fighters, and Force One was full of orphans and those left out by people. In other words, people who had nothing to lose, people like him. Before we continue, take a moment to answer the question of the day. What would you do if you could regress? Comment down below for a chance to be shouted out. Now back to the recap. In Force One, they got a place to sleep, clothes to wear, and the hope of money until they died. He was thankful for all of it. They fought together, beating pirates at sea and taking down terrorist leaders on land. Sometimes he would even fight in global wars to make more money. The cashier told him it would be 240,000 won and asked him what he would use the machete for, because usually it's something collectors buy and it's not very useful for things like cutting wood or camping. She asked him again if he wanted to see other machetes that might work better, but he said it was fine and he'd take it. He had been thinking about getting a new machete as his old one was dull, and he could feel the strength in that machete just by holding it. Then he pointed to the bubble wrap and asked the lady for 10 meters of it. She agreed and started to cut it, but he saw that the cutter was dull and got mad because the blade was dull and the lady was making a mess. So he called her over, making her confused. But he just lifted his machete and swung it in the air, making her scared. Then she saw that he just cut the bubble wrap quicker. Huayun's attention was caught by someone loudly asking what was happening and if there was a special event going on. People were gathered around, happy and taking pictures of something, but he and the other people were filled with terror when it jumped at them, holding a sharp knife. The man was about to run when it appeared behind him and cut his back with a knife. Then the man fell down dead, and the goblin started eating him. Huayun wondered what was happening and noticed that it looked like one of those goblins from games. But then the goblin looked back at him, making him step back in fear. Then it jumped at him to attack, but luckily he cut it in half, still wondering what on earth was going on in the mart. They could hear something shouting in anger, and Huayun was catching his breath while green blood was dripping on his machete. He smelled an overwhelming stench of blood, but then he heard someone shouting for help. When he looked back, he saw a lot of people dead on the ground and many goblins smiling, looking at someone. The goblin ran toward the lady who was with a child and begging for God to help them. Fortunately, he jumped just in time to slice those goblins in half, protecting the lady and her child. The lady, looking scared, asked him what was happening and where those things were coming from. He just stared, puzzled. His machete didn't cut well, so he thought, "I need something better." Suddenly, angry growls echoed, and heaps of furious goblins were glaring at him. He raised his machete, wondering why they kept coming. Then someone shouted to fight them, and the men attacked with different tools. One of them smashed a goblin's head, ordering it to back off, but one man was shaking, begging God to save him. He told the shaky man it wasn't a dream, and he'd better get it together. He wielded a chainsaw, urging the man that praying wouldn't save him. Right now they needed more people to fight these goblins, so they all attacked together. One goblin sneaked up on the scared man, but he managed to slice its head in half. He praised the frightened man, realizing that even if someone is weak, the desire to survive is strong. Then one man called them over and pointed at a portal. He said it must be where the monsters were coming from, and they had to get rid of it. One guy asked how, but he admitted he didn't know. Suddenly, a hand with sharp nails emerged from the portal, and the grinning goblins followed, shocking them. In moments, many people lay on the ground, and he saw the situation worsening. More goblins poured out, and the people were getting tired. At this rate, they couldn't beat these creatures. Plus, they couldn't explain why these monsters were here, and the dimensional rift they came from was beyond understanding. He counted the goblins, making the man puzzled. He explained there were 10 in each wave, with 10 minutes between each wave. Currently, there were 26 goblins, and in 10 minutes there'd be 10 more. The problem was, even though he understood the situation, he couldn't figure out how to solve it. The store had limited weapons, mainly heavy ones like axes, crowbars, chainsaws, and hammers. Using these drained a lot of energy, and they required close combat. Fighting these monsters up close was daunting, but he knew that one mistake and they'd be in big trouble. Many of the people in the hardware store had already lost their lives, and the ones who were still fighting looked completely exhausted. He thought that if only he had a gun. Suddenly someone shouted, "Fire!" and a missile was launched. It hit the creature behind them, leaving him in shock. One of the men informed them that they were the Capital Defense Command's counter-terrorism response team, and they were now safe. They instructed everyone to help the injured nearby and move toward them. The team of soldiers swiftly took their positions and began firing at the goblins, attempting to attack the people. On the other hand, he found himself next to a frightened man who thanked him with a shaky voice. The man introduced himself as Kimbo, but he simply replied that he was tired and walked away, telling Bowen to continue on his own. Wayun had grown weary of carrying weaker individuals. His experience as a mercenary in battles worldwide had taught him that the weak could be a heavy burden. He didn't want to be burdened when the situation was still dire. Moreover, with soldiers armed with guns nearby, he saw even less need for someone like Bowen. However, frustration boiled within him as he noticed the soldiers breathing heavily and standing in an unstable posture. They were a mess, and it infuriated him. He ordered one of the soldiers to hand over the gun and introduced himself as Lee Wayun from Force 1. The man asked him to repeat his name, but he didn't waste time. He snatched the gun and released his chainsaw. The captain of the soldiers questioned why he allowed his gun to be taken and ordered him to take a break. Wayun ignored the order, keeping his aim steady at the advancing goblins. Then he began firing, every bullet finding its mark, hitting the goblins without a single miss. The captain asked the soldier, shocked at what he just saw, "What's going on here?" The man who had his gun stolen replied, "Huayun said he was from Force 1. The captain's eyes widened in disbelief. He knew Force 1 was the most ruthless mercenary company in the world. This was bad news. Just as the goblin was about to attack the people, he hit them on the head. Then he charged at the goblins, and the soldiers rushed to help the people. Together they fought off the goblins and kept moving until everyone was safe. But then something strange happened. A strange system popped up in front of the captain. It said the game was restarting. He was confused, scratching his head and closing his eyes in frustration. He couldn't make sense of it. Ever since he walked into that hardware store, bizarre things had been happening one after another. He wondered if the text in front of him was real. The system still hovered in front of him, and the fact that it said restarting instead of starting made his head spin even more. Those monstrous creatures and the dimensional rift were unlike anything he had ever seen. He glanced around, and it was clear that no one in the hardware store had any clue about this situation either. Trying to understand it all seemed foolish, considering how nothing had made sense since he walked in here. Suddenly there was a loud crash behind him. He turned around to see an orc with sharp teeth growling angrily. The soldiers fired their guns, but the bullets did nothing. He tried to attack the orc, but it was as if his efforts were in vain. Then someone unexpected jumped forward with an axe and swiftly struck behind the orc's knees. The orc crumpled to the ground. A blue-haired man, the once trembling weakling from earlier, revealed that an orc's weakness was its lower body. They could be taken down easily by making them lose their balance. The soldiers stood in shock, wondering who this person was. The blue-haired man, who had been frightened by a small goblin not long ago, now seemed to know everything. His actions were anything but clumsy. The blue-haired man easily finished off the orc. But the ordeal was far from over. 2 more orcs slowly emerged from the portal, growling menacingly, getting their attention, but he was shocked to see the kid running toward the orcs. He remembers that it was the kid who was begging his father to buy him a monkey wrench just a couple of hours ago. Even with the knowledge of what the orc's weakness is, it's reckless to fight an orc with just that information, especially for a young boy with that small body. However, he notices that the little boy is just casually slaughtering orcs, as if it isn't his first time doing so. But then he notices that it wasn't just the kid, because the lady in the cashier area was simply rolling a chain in the air. He remembers that she was the employee who cut the bubble wrap. She is displaying similar behaviour and is currently taking down orcs left and right without the slightest trace of emotion in her eyes. Then he realised that the man named Kim Boan, who is currently slashing at an orc body with an axe, is the same person who is praying on his knees as he was being attacked by a monster. Also, that little kid who was throwing a tantrum at his father like a regular child, and that female employee who had spoken to him in a warm and kind tone, was simply attacking the orcs. It made him wonder what on earth is going on. Then he heard the captain telling the soldiers to hold their fire and calling them idiots. Then behind him, he heard the people cheering that the god heard their prayers and they are saved. He wonders what is the difference between the people who suddenly changed and fought the orcs and those who didn't, and what caused their sudden change. Then a system pops up in front of him telling him that there is no tutorial in that game. However, he may ask 3 questions about the game, so he should choose his questions carefully. Our main character has a nickname, and it was given to him when he entered the world's most ruthless mercenary company and roamed the battlefields. It was Fearless, one who does not fear anything. It's a nickname given by the foreigners in his team, as he always kept his cool and exercised calm judgment regardless of the situation. He was thankful for those traits because he was able to survive amid a chaotic battlefield full of bullets and debris. The system explained to him that the right to ask questions is given to all humans who have been selected as players, making him once again realize that it would be foolish to try to understand the entire situation and say that it wasn't even funny anymore. He doesn't doubt the messages that have appeared right before his eyes, as everything that he has witnessed is real. He asked the system, "What's going on?" The system's reply was unsettling. It said it's the end of the world and a test for humans mixed with video games. He told it to stop the nonsense, but it insisted he ask carefully. Annoyed by the mechanical female voice, he thought about smashing through like in games, but he knew that wouldn't work here since it's only text and voice. The system said it'd add to the answer and opened a status window. He chuckled, seeing himself at level 1 with low stats. This strange message about games becoming real seemed true. The system explained he'd become a player, and gates had appeared worldwide, leading to monster-filled dungeons. He thought about training to save humanity, but had a more pressing question. He asked, why did the kid, the employee, and the guy in glasses become like this? The system didn't know. They might be natural-born players, it said. He sighed, and was about to reply, when the system made a strange, broken sound. He wondered what was wrong with it. Then the system showed that he was the only player who has not regressed, and to maintain the balance of the game, the player would receive a special skill. His curiosity grew as the system proceeded to search for this special skill. He asked the system what it meant to be the only one who didn't regress, and if everyone else had gone back in time. To his surprise, it was a word he'd heard many times on the brutal battlefield, regress. He'd often shouted it in frustration, wishing to return to the past. Now it all began to make sense. The game restarting, the ease with which ordinary people slaughtered the orcs, and the absurd words of the system, they were all true. Frustration welled up, and he couldn't help but curse in anger. He questioned if any of it made sense. It was at that very moment he realized that everyone had indeed regressed except him. He attempted to ask another question, but the system was busy searching for that elusive special skill. Suddenly, an old lady appeared, her face twisted in anger. She questioned what he was doing and urged him to join the fight, praising his earlier prowess. His anger flared, and he retorted that she hadn't uttered a word when the monsters were right in front of her, so she should remain quiet. She stood there, stunned into silence. He inquired if she had regressed as well, but she only replied with confusion, asking what regress meant. He tried to explain that it meant coming back to the past from the future, but she still didn't comprehend. However, this encounter brought another revelation. In addition to the strange monsters, the system messages revealed that only those who had become players had regressed. It was as if they were proving they were from the future. These players, including him, were strategically targeting the orcs' weak spots, a skill they seemed to have gained from their knowledge of the future. He realized, with a mix of confusion and awe, that he was the only one who didn't possess this foreknowledge. He shook his head, feeling like a massive headache was building up inside him. He knew he shouldn't rush into making any quick judgments. Just then, a man walked up to him, looking somewhat familiar, and asked if he could introduce himself. Bone was taken aback for a moment, but then he realized who this man was. He blurted out that this man was the reason he became a player, and he'd been searching for him his whole life. Bowen had travelled from dungeon to dungeon all across Korea, driven by the need to meet this man. The man before him, still bewildered, asked what was going on. In his confusion, Bowen explained that today was the turning point of his entire life. If this man hadn't helped him out and handed him a chainsaw, he would have remained a basement loser forever. The man, slowly comprehending the gravity of the situation, realized that Bowen was speaking as though he'd been to the future. Bowen, brimming with excitement, explained that the only reason he'd achieved any success as a player was because he saw this man as his role model. He asked if the man knew him well. With equal enthusiasm, Bowen replied that there wasn't a single player in Korea who didn't know him. He was Lee Hwa-yoon, the player who had conquered the final dungeon, and this revelation left the man shocked and confused. The term final dungeon was completely new to him. Just as he was about to say something, a lady and a kid ran over to them. The lady was thrilled and admitted that she hadn't realized back then that one of the people she had fought alongside in the beginning was him. The kid chimed in, sharing that the image of him entering the final dungeon while flipping off countless reporters was etched in his memory forever. To them, these people were the ones who had battled orcs, in other words, players who had regressed. Bowen expressed his interest in hearing about what happened in the final dungeon, but the man was still trying to grasp the situation. Everyone was talking about this place called the final dungeon. Suddenly, a system interface appeared in front of him, notifying him that the special skill search was completed. It urged him to check his status window. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. His eyes widened in shock as he read the name of his special skill, Butterfly Effect, Level 1. It meant that he was the only one who hadn't regressed, and bonus points would be awarded for actions that changed the future. He knows exactly what the butterfly effect means, how the flutter of a butterfly's wings can cause a huge storm halfway around the world. As he gazed at the fluttering insect, his mind wandered to the bonus points it promised. But suddenly, a deafening crash from behind broke his concentration. Startled, they turned to see a horde of orcs pouring out of a swirling portal. Without hesitation, the players sprinted towards the approaching orcs. He raised his gun and fired, frustration gnawing at him. Of all times, why did more orcs have to appear? He knew being a player came with changes, like seeing a monster's name and level above its head. He aimed at an orc's head and squeezed the trigger, but the creature only glared back in anger, seemingly unfazed. Frustration turned to realization as he noticed the bullets left faint scorch marks. Even firearms couldn't penetrate the orc's tough skin. He remembered that simple close combat weapons worked because the people using them were regressors. They knew the orcs' weak spots, targeting their joints, which were relatively weaker. His gun seemed useless against these formidable foes. He decided against aiming for the joints, as the bullets were too small to do any significant damage. The orcs remained standing, a menacing presence. Desperation set in as he considered his options. He glanced around and spotted a chainsaw on the ground. The power of regression amazed him, but as his eyes lifted, he saw an axe a short distance away. Without hesitation, he abandoned the chainsaw for the axe, hoping it would be more effective against the approaching orcs. The system then revealed to him that the special skill butterfly effect had been activated, and he had altered the future, earning bonus points +1. His confusion lingered, and he pondered how he'd shifted the future. Setting the axe aside, he grasped the electric drill. Once again, the system displayed that he'd changed the future, awarding him bonus points +1. But suddenly, an orc emerged behind him, and with great strength he hurled the axe, striking the orc's knees forcefully, sending it crashing to the ground. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward it, seized the axe, raised it high, and decapitated the orc. Curious about the past, he inquired of Bowen whether he'd used an axe in the same situation previously. Bowen recollected and mentioned using a chainsaw. A grin spread across his face as realization dawned. Doing something different from what had occurred in the past was akin to altering the future. While not entirely certain, it made sense to him. He believed that he should now do the opposite of what he'd done in his previous life. Moments later, Bowen recounted how he'd single-handedly slain 3 orcs in the past. He pointed towards something nearby, indicating that he'd employed it. Following Bowen's gesture, he spotted a container of thinner. He knew that thinner could revive hardened paint and was highly flammable. He remarked that it was intriguing and approached the thinner, contemplating how it might have been used to burn the orcs to death. He picked up another tool, understanding that using it meant he'd be doing something different from the past. Alternatively, he could use the thinner to eliminate all the orcs, or choose not to kill any at all. The system signalled that he'd altered the future once more, granting him bonus points +1. Though fatigued from his efforts, the other players agreed to his plan. He inflicted injuries upon the orcs by targeting their Achilles tendons and knee joints, before dousing the fallen orcs with thinner and igniting them. As the orcs burned, the system revealed another change in the future, awarding him bonus points +1 and levelling him up, which brought an additional bonus of 3 points. He now comprehended that by doing the opposite of his past actions, he earned bonus points. Though he remained unsure of their purpose, it seemed natural. He also believed that even without these bonus points, beheading the orcs would still be an effortless task. The system showed him that he achieved the brave rookie and explained that the achievement is awarded to players who complete a hunt without using any bonus points. Also, a skill will be awarded for earning that achievement, so he gained armor level 1, making him confused. But then a bright light wrapped around him and gave him black gloves. He looked at it and asked what it was. The man cursed because he thought it would be his that time, and the lady angrily asked, when did he even get that skill? He asked them what with those faces and if there was a problem that he got that skill. The lady replied that there was, of course, a problem because he devoured all of Korea with that overpowered skill, and the man told him that he can't believe he just missed the chance of getting that insane skill, making him realize that he must have gotten that skill in his past as well. He also thinks that it should be the case as the butterfly effect skill was not activated, and the future only changes if he does something new. But the skill wasn't activated when he got the brave rookie achievement and the armor skill. Then the portal released a powerful power and rumbled loudly. He stepped forward to it while the players were looking at him, and Bao-on seriously glaring at him. Before we continue, let's take a moment to shout out at Java Campbell 6343, who commented Rias on our auto hunting video. Thanks for commenting and answering the question of the day. He stopped walking when the system popped up in front of him and told him that it was a dungeon of goblins and orcs with 11 goblins and 8 orcs. Also, the max number of players is 4, and it was dungeon difficulty D negative. He thinks that the game was definitely first created with the annihilation of the human race in mind, and there is a fixed number of monsters in each dungeon. After a certain period of time, the monsters in the dungeon would come out of the dungeon gate and destroy everything. He also notices that those monster-filled dungeons are connected to Earth via gates, so there is only one way to destroy a gate. Then he told them that they have to kill all the monsters as quickly as possible, because the number of monsters in the dungeon and the maximum number of players that can enter it is stated on the dungeon information. But he knows that the dungeon's difficulty is important, as it determines the rarity of skills and items that can be dropped. Then he told them that its difficulty is D negative, which means it was a dungeon above rare grade, and he thinks even so he still has a reason for wanting to enter that dungeon because he wants to do an experiment. He wants to test out the stats he has gained as a player and the newly acquired skill armor. He knows that he was at a disadvantage with regard to information about the world, so he needs power that he can immediately see. After all, strength is actual power. Also, the armor means it strengthens and hardens the player's body, and the toughness of the armor is in proportion to the player's strength with bonus points of 15. This made him realize that those bonus points are the points he got from the butterfly effect. Then he told the system to apply all his bonus points to strength. He proceeded to walk toward the dungeon while thinking that he has already defeated countless goblins and knows the weakness of the orcs, so he needs to be prepared for unknown dangers. That's why he chose that place as his first hunting ground. Meanwhile, Bo, who was following behind him, thought that perhaps Hwayun got something from there in his previous life. They entered the dungeon and started to walk while looking around without noticing a goblin smiling and hiding from their side. They were shocked when goblins appeared behind them. One of them bit his arm but was shocked that it couldn't bite him. The system showed him that his armor was activated, while the goblin looked at him in shock. Then he reached for the goblin and grabbed its head. Then he squeezed it to death. The system showed that he has changed the future, so he gained bonus points +1 and showed him that he was level 2 with 16 strengths, and his skills are butterfly effect level 1 and armor level 1. He noticed that his strength is at 16 when it hasn't been 5 hours since the game began. He threw the goblin on the ground, making the lady fearfully say that it was ridiculous, and the man can't believe that he crushed the goblin's skull with just one hand. Bo asked him just how he did it, and told him that the skill armor is the only one of its kind in the world. It was probably because of that skill that he was considered the strongest player in Korea in his previous life. But he just asked Bo, "So what?" Boan replied that he'll be taking it. Then Boan snatched the chainsaw from the man and launched it toward him, making him surprised. Boan attacked him with the chainsaw, but the chainsaw didn't pierce through, making him laugh and think that even if he didn't regress, it wasn't right. Absolutely not. He lifted his hand, knowing that it was his turn. He simply grabbed the working chainsaw and snapped it into two. Then he threw it to the side and grabbed Bo by the neck. He lifted Bo, who was level 3, with one hand and Bo with surprise, but he just told him that it was a shame while thinking that at the end of greed lies destruction. He learned it himself on the battlefield and has a wound to remind him about it. Also, he knows that as those players have regressed to the hardware store at the same time he awakened, they must have thought that they would be able to get the skills he had in his previous life. Then he asked others if they want to try too and told them to get lost. He tightened his grip on Bo's neck and snapped Bo's neck. He looked at the dead Bo on the ground and remembered that on the battlefield, what he received in return for releasing his enemies was not gratitude but more bullets, and that is how it always was. Then he told them that the law is meaningless now that the game has started, and told them to get lost if they don't want to die. He knew he couldn't let his feelings mess things up when dealing with someone who had threatened him before. It felt like a really mean game though. When a player died, their stuff just popped up for anyone to take, but he said it was handy. So he snatched a necklace from the Goblin Champion. It boosted his strength and agility. Pretty cool. He even got bonus points for it. He thought about how much it helped him level up. It was like 2 levels at once. Some guy asked him why he wore such a weird necklace, but he just grabbed a chainsaw off the ground. An orc was coming at him, so he shoved the chainsaw into the orc's mouth and sliced its face in half. He couldn't really feel the necklace's power though. Then, the game said they'd killed all the monsters in the dungeon. They had to run because the place would blow in 3 minutes. He headed for the exit, leaving goblins and orcs lying around. He knew the only way to close the gate was to kill everything inside. When the monsters were gone, the gate vanished too. It was like the law didn't matter anymore. Even those players who got sent back didn't know what happened to the ones left inside. Nobody ever came back once the gate was gone. Bodies just disappeared with it. He gazes at Bowen's lifeless body, wondering if it's why the dungeons let players escape before they crumble. Then, his attention shifts to the upset kid who was throwing a fit near his father's lifeless form. He gently approaches the child and asks why he's here, if he wants to stay in this dangerous place. The kid sniffs, tears streaming, and replies with a shaky voice, "No, I want to be with you." He sighs softly, explaining they should head through the nearby gate to safety. But the child pleads, his cries echoing in the chamber, begging to come along. Frustration creeps into his voice as he insists, "Stop it!" He opens his status window and allocates his bonus points to strength. Now, his strength stands at 28, even surpassing a level 9 player who focuses solely on strength. He sternly tells the sobbing child to cut it out. The kid, tears still flowing, reveals they've travelled back in time a whole decade. He urges the child to be brave, to which the kid retorts, "Even in 10 years my life will still be the same. I want to be a hero, just once." He studies the kid, now knowing him as Kim Minsu, intrigued by the boy's unusual story. Minsu confides that he wishes to be a hero's right-hand man, a sincere desire. He leans in, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth, and tells Minsu, "You're quite the interesting one." It dawns on him. Minsu holds the secrets of the next 10 years. What will happen next? Find out next time by staying tuned for our future recaps. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more great recaps.